silly. Oh, God.
So she like.
Pastors here at First Baptist Church of Decatur. We are always so thankful to be able to welcome folks into this space where we like to think of this as sort of a community gathering spot where we have our imaginations stretched and our spirits challenged, and we have excellent authors and people like you who love to read and to have our lives enriched by excellent literature. And so tonight is another one of the evenings where we get to hear from very smart people talking about great topics that will allow all of us to benefit. I always want to thank the Georgia Center for the Book and Joe Davich, our partner, and Allie Wright for the good work that they do and for allowing us to be involved in the excitement of good literature and reading and having our imaginations stretched. Welcome this evening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of this great series, and we hope you enjoy this evening.
Thank you so much, David. And just very quickly to get this evening rolling, of course, don't forget, this series was actually scheduled to be part of the Decatur Book Festival before the pandemic began. It was supposed to be on the stage of the library, and when the pandemic hit, we kind of pivoted very quickly and put it online, and it has been here for the third iteration now. It shows no signs of stopping, and thank you all for joining us here and for joining us at home. I would like to remind you that, yes, the Decatur Book Festival will be back on October 1st here at First Baptist Church. And of course, we'd like to thank First Baptist so much for not only hosting our events, but also hosting the Book Festival as well. And of course, we'd also like to thank the sponsors of the Book Festival, including Emory University, the City of Decatur, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the DeKalb County Public Library, and the DeKalb Library Foundation. They get a little bit of extra thanks because, they pay to keep the lights on at our offices over at the Decatur Library. So thank you all for coming out both to our programs and to the library. It kind of keeps me in a job. Just to let you know that this series took a lot of planning to do, and without the help of Joshilyn Jackson and Nikki Salcedo and our two guest moderators this year, Ginger Eager and Carmen Tanner Slaughter, this series would not happen after the months of preparation it took. Don't forget that our last event is next Thursday, and it will be Nikki Salcedo in conversation with Sonali Dev about her book called The Emma Project. So I am very thrilled that this themed evening turned out so well because it seems that Jackie Kennedy Onassis is still on everybody's mind, but it's actually just more about Jackie. It's about the people that surrounded her and enriched her lives, and the people that supported her even behind the scenes, like Miss Ann Lowe. And you're going to find out about these extraordinary people that got to be in her circle and in that little sphere of light. Piper Huguley, of course, has written By Her Own Design, which is a historical fiction about Miss Ann Lowe and designing that very iconic wedding dress. And Louis Bayard is, of course, the author of Jackie and Me, taking place in 1951, right as she's starting to take photographs and work for a Washington newspaper. Of course, the lady directly to my left, we all should know, Ms. Joshilyn Jackson. She is a New York Times best-selling author of Gods in Alabama and Between Georgia, but right now she writes crackling good thrillers like Never Have I Ever and Mother May I. And of course, in about 2 seconds, you will certainly see how infectious and contagious her passion is for reading and books. So without further ado, will you please welcome Joshilyn, Louis, and Piper. Thank you all so much.
Hey, y'all. I'm not infectious or contagious, I swear to God. Just tested. I'm super, super, super excited to be here. I loved these books. We are going to, the first thing I'm going to do is let each author tell you a little bit, just to wet your whistle, like, give us your elevator pitch. Tell these guys what these books we're going to be talking about, what they're about.
Oh, I have to go first? All right, fine. So elevator pitch. This is elevator pitch?
I mean, just like, what is this book about?
It's about some girl named Jackie. I'm sure you haven't heard of her anywhere. No. I would say that this is the book about Jackie before she was the Jackie you know. Like, we all have different images of her. She was the wife of the president in the pillbox hat. She was the beautiful widow with the beautiful children. She was the wife to the Greek tycoon. She was the paparazzi magnate, familiar to generations of tabloid readers. I know you were all one of them. Don't even pretend you weren't. She was the book editor, and she was the style icon, so many avenues into this enduringly interesting, mysterious woman. I chose the avenue, that window, before she became that Jackie, when she's still a working girl in Washington, D.C. She's the inquiring camera girl for the Washington Times-Herald, and she takes her camera into the streets and buttonholes strangers, which is hard for her to do because she's shy, asks them random questions and takes their pictures, and puts out this column 6 days a week. But she also gets invited to a Georgetown dinner party and meets a congressman named John Kennedy, and eventually meets he's Jack's best friend, Lem Billings, who's been his best friend from high school through life. So it becomes a kind of interesting love triangle involving a famous politician, a soon-to-be famous woman, and a closeted gay man who is just trying to make everyone happy. There we go.
Piper?
who is from Pittsburgh, which I was so glad to find out.
right?
I was born in Pittsburgh and raised in Pittsburgh. So, By Her Own Design is a novel that walks the reader through the life of Ann Lowe, who was born in Clayton, Alabama in 1898. And one would think that a young black girl born in those circumstances would not rise to the circumstances that she managed to, but she became a fashion designer to the wealthy women of the social register. And she designed evening gowns and wedding gowns for Roosevelt's and Vanderbilt's and DuPont's and the Auchincloss family, which she started her first commission for Jackie's mother. And that's how she...
We're going to talk about Jackie's
And she
mother.
got into ultimately designing for Jackie and her sister over a period of about a decade and a half. When we think of fashion, we don't think of black faces taking place in the pantheon of people that we know by their last names and the clothing that we wear and whatever. And so By Her Own Design is part of my attempt to put Ann Lowe there in some way to show her amazing life story journey. So that's what it's about.
I just want to tell you that Joe and Nikki Salcedo and I, these are, all the books in this series are books that are either, if we hadn't had a chance to read them yet because they weren't out, they were by authors that we had loved other things before, or we asked for ARCs and we read them. These books are so freaking good. I also want to tell you that Eagle Eye Books is out there, which is your local independent bookstore, and this is for you people at home online too. You need to go to Eagle Eye and order these books. They're keeper shelf books, and we have to keep our independent bookstores alive. So I'm just going to go ahead and encourage you right now. You're going to want both of these. So I went to high school, and in 10th grade, I went to American history, where I learned that white straight men did everything that was interesting. And something that this book has in common is you're taking the whitest, straightest presidential Marilyn Monroe humping fella that we've, excuse me, that was tacky, I apologize. It just came out of my face.
We're in a church. We're in a church.
Yeah, we're in my church. That's my pastor. He knows me. It's okay. So he knows what he's got here.
Yeah.
So one thing that these books have in common, and they're very different books, I think, even in intent, is that we're taking this white-hot historical Kennedy light, and we're using it to look at a gay man who was in several ways totally invisible, and a black woman who was not invisible, who should have been invisible but was not, who overcame history. So talk to me a little bit about how both of you, let's start with Piper this time, how you decided to choose this lens, how you got interested in this person, this topic, because this is a real person. Mm-hmm. I did not know that. I knew that yours was, I knew that she was a real person, but we'll talk about that difference too, but you go.
Well, actually, she was invisible. People who read Jackie biographies, they don't really name her. Kitty Kelly, who wrote the most famous one, Jackie, calls her the family seamstress. There's no name there. She was known. One of the subtitles that had been going around for the book before it was published was Society's Best Kept Secret. That this was a thing amongst the wealthy women to exchange the name of this woman amongst themselves, I guess to avoid duplication of their outfits, but that wasn't a problem for Ann Lowe because she designed, everything that she did was custom to the customer in terms of that. As for where I found out about her, I always knew about her in the back of my mind in terms of Black history, but one evening I was going through Twitter and my editor, whom I had known from conferences or whatever, she retweeted out somebody's article about Ann Lowe and said, does somebody want to write this novel? And I went and I read the article and I looked on the internet for some of the other things. I said, now that's a novel. I said, yes, I would. And my agent, who had been, she might have been on the point of despair with me, I don't know. I said, what about this? What do you think? And she said, yes, let's go for it. So I wrote up 2 pages, the prologue, very quickly, and sent that to her, and she sent it to Tessa, and I said, yeah, lock this down so that nobody else goes along with that tweet thinking that, that they'll write this novel. And the beginning part, the prologue that I wrote, actually, I knew, because I'm such a huge nerd, I knew that Anne Lowe had died on the day after Charles and Diana became engaged. So I just thought and wondered, what would a woman who was looking back on her life have to think about that upcoming commission? Because Jackie's wedding gown is one of the most photographed wedding dresses in history, not unlike Diana's. So,
Yeah. And she couldn't just like another like she was a designer who was reduced to a seamstress, and she couldn't walk into that world. She would be highly visible and not allowed. Like I'm going to be real careful about spoilers here, but there's a section where she sort of has a job offer, and there's this thing like, are you sure I can go to that neighborhood? And it's sort of this weird negotiation because she's so visible. And then to have her become completely invisible after the fact, like she can't go into the space, and then her name can't even go into the space.
Yeah,
and
that's
you
true.
have a completely opposite situation where you have this very sophisticated, privileged, urbane person who fits perfectly in the space if you're just looking on the surface.
Yeah, he met Jack at Choate, which is as white and privileged as you can get. And they went to Princeton together. Jack had to drop out after first semester because of medical issues. But it's interesting you talk about invisibility, because I feel like Lem was by design invisible. There are a bunch of White House photographs from the Kennedy administration, and Lem is in so many of them. But he's always in the background. He's this Zelig-like figure who keeps popping up in the background of all these sort of state, signings and rose garden ceremonies. And he's always this tall guy in the back. You have no idea who he is. But because he showed up every weekend. He had his own room at the White House. The Secret Service just waved him through. But in his own mind, his only role was to be Jack's best friend. He refused any kind of official appointments. He didn't want to head up the Peace Corps, which was offered to him apparently, or be an ambassador to Norway or whatever. He just wanted to be Jack's best friend, and that's what Jack leaned on him for. He was the guy that Jack called at the end of the day when he was tired, and he just wanted to shoot the bull, or tell a joke, or play backgammon. He was that release valve for Jack, and he treasured that role and really lived into it, but at the cost to his own identity and perhaps the cost to his own long-term happiness, because he never had a long-term partner or anything like that. He lived his life for Jack and for the Kennedy family. How
did you become aware of him?
I received a issue of my college alumni magazine. It's called the Alumni Weekly, even though it's bi-weekly, and that's confusing to me still after all these years. And there was this picture of these 2 young men, these collegiates from 1930s Princeton, and they were doing this kind of mock, almost Mae West pose, with their kind of leaning on a wall and cocking their hips toward the camera and looking very flirtatious. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is some gay couple that they captured in pre-Stonewall, Ivy League. And then they scurried back to safety as soon as the picture was taken. But then I looked at the smaller of the 2 men, and he's like very slight and rather pretty and rather familiar. And I kept looking, and I suddenly was looking at a young John Fitzgerald Kennedy. So then my eyes traveled to the larger guy, and he was this tall, bespectacled blonde with this very juicy, with this big grin and this overbite and this air of hilarity that just seems to burst through the frame. And that's how I learned. So the whole article was about this relationship and about Lem himself, and his life of service to the Kennedys. But also a rather sad life because, as I said, he was, I always fall back on this phrase, back in the day, and some people remember this, they used to refer to people like Lem as practicing homosexuals, and I always loved that phrase because I used to think if they keep practicing, will they get better? Will they get better at it? So he was and the interesting thing too is that apparently Jack and Jackie both understood. I think everyone did understand that he was gay, and they were very live and let live about it. They didn't raise a stink, but at the same time, Lem wasn't free, given the social mores of that time, to live in an out way. So we find him. He's narrating the book from 1981, just before AIDS comes in. And he's still kind of struggling to find out who he is and to find his own version of happiness.
It seems to me that these two books, although they have a lot of things in common, and we're going to get to those too, it seems to me and we'll start with you, Piper, on this if you don't mind, there's a difference of intent here. You have called this book an alternate history. And you have called this book, I can't remember the exact word, it was like an unearthing of a hidden history? Or is that something like that? Very similar. I did not bring my notes with me. I had it written down. But so it seemed like this was sort of a reimagining of a situation, and this was a bringing to life of a hidden situation. Talk to me about those intents and how you decided to come at these stories, and how much they're, like, in terms of research, how much was there for you? How much imagination work did you have to do?
Yeah, well, for a black woman who's born at this time in 1898 in eastern Alabama, which is where Clayton is, there's not much to begin with there in terms of her life. The fortunate thing is that she hails from the county 2 counties over from where my paternal ancestors came from. There's a Huguley, Alabama. In Chambers County. If anybody's ever gone down I-85, you might see the road signs too. It's really just as podunk as Clayton is. So I had a familiarity with what her young life might look like from my family. But, you know, like I said, there's not much, there's not even birth certificates in terms of that, which, you know, kind of gets to be important in terms of Anne's situation as she grows up to a certain extent.
Just, can you talk about that a little bit? Because especially in terms of her first marriage and her age, while we're here, let's talk about that so we don't forget.
Yeah, her child marriage, where she was merely 12
and a half.
When she married, which is not unprecedented. It's also a situation that unfortunately is still kind of relevant, given that Tennessee was trying to pull some shenanigans a couple of months ago by not limiting the age of marriage. It still is with us. And there, you know, been questions about her age, etc. But she always insisted, and this actually went on record when she appeared on the Mike Douglas show in 1964, of her age at that time. And she said what her age was. So yeah, there's certain that kind of thing in terms of, had she really been a child bride? The census record in 1910, which was one of the things that was available. Anne is living with this man, who is her husband, and it's 21 that's recorded on the census record. And so, you know, I have some questions in the author's note about the notation of that age, who said it, and why they would have said it.
Dyslexic, somebody dyslexic.
Yeah, exactly. In terms of that. So, these things happen, and I know some people who have written my previous historical works, they weren't used to this kind of thing, but it did happen. And it was an early history of hers that she tried to cover over once, you know, people, the wealthy women she was seeking to design for had expressed their distaste, you know, in terms of it. But she had a son when she was 15. So you can only hide a kid, but for so long in terms of that kind of thing. So, but otherwise, in terms of research, mostly I leaned on a dissertation written by a young textile scholar named Margaret Powell, who the book is dedicated to, because Margaret unfortunately died of breast cancer when she was something like 38 years old. But she had, one of the things I'd gone to in terms of looking at Anne's life on the internet were her blogs, where from about 2010 to about that time, 2019, she had been blogging about Anne Lowe in preparation for hopefully an exhibit and a comprehensive scholarly biography on Ann Lowe. And then she died, so she wasn't able to accomplish either one of those things. Fortunately, next year in Delaware, I think it's the Winter Third, they're having an exhibit where they're going to recreate the dress for the 70th wedding anniversary in September.
I'm there.
Hopefully I'm there too. And I guess the comprehensive scholarly biography, you have to wait and see if it's going to come up. But one of the reasons I wanted to do this was to hopefully light a spark in someone who is a textile scholar who might want to take that project on, because Anne deserves it.
Great. And can you talk to me a little bit about intent and...
Sure. Well, it seems to me one of the privileges and prerogatives of a historical novelist is to go into those worlds where the historical record falls silent. So many of the times it's a person of color, or it's women, or it's queers. The record really falls silent about them. So it's I feel like a kind of sacred mission to kind of wade into these lives and help figure out how they would have lived and how somebody like Lem would have gotten by. For instance, he was definitely a white man of privilege. Princeton and Choate and all those things, but he would have lived a life of kind of terror. Afraid of being arrested. He would have hooked up with men wherever he could, hoping that they weren't an undercover cop or a thug or someone who was going to rat them out a minute later or 20 years later. And I think that carries forward. So one of the issues that comes up in the book is that even in 1981, he can't declare who he is. The word gay never comes up in this book because he can't use it. He can't use it to describe himself. He's a refugee. He's an escapee. So that part of that was the privilege of the fun of the book was trying to capture some of that world and some of the fear in that world. But someone was trying to capture the Jackie that didn't get through. This career girl, who's the thing she said in her yearbook for Miss Porter's School of Girls was her goal in life was, quote, not to be a housewife. And she was working hard, and she won this prestigious scholarship with Vogue magazine. And so, but at the same time, she was a woman of her time, and she had a lot of pressure from Mrs. Auchincloss to kind of get settled down and find the right husband. That was women of her era and class were supposed to do. So she's a very conflicted kind of, I think of her as Lily Bart, if you've ever read The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. I think that's kind of who I had in mind when I was thinking of her. She's working both toward and against the grain of matrimony through the whole book.
And she's shockingly vulnerable in some ways in this book, in a way that I know, in the pictures and the history, I just don't think of her as, I don't think of her as being young and uncertain and vulnerable. And in both of these books, there are these moments where we see her as a girl, as a real, alive human girl, instead of, the perfect posture and the pillbox hat. There are several crossover characters that are in both of these books, and we're going to talk about one of them now. And I don't want to say she's a piece of work, but my God, she's a piece of work. Let's talk about Jackie's mother, because I would not have known this woman ever existed. This was my first two introductions to this woman. So, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce her last name. I will leave that to the experts, but off we go.
Auchincloss.
Very good.
Yes.
Who's wasn't a descendant who's currently in Congress, actually. So there's still
What?
Auchincloss, Representative Auchincloss.
They still walk the land. They still.
Walking the earth in impeccable shoes on positive.
Exactly. Ann Lowe, again, this 1964 appearance on the Mike Douglas Show, which was not available to me when I was writing. It had to be rediscovered and put on the internet. I know. I was like, I wanted to go to Philadelphia and knock on Group W's doors and said, I know it's in there, give it to me. But I wasn't able to do that. It's recently been unearthed, and it's on the internet. If you want to go see it.
YouTube?
It's on YouTube, yeah.
I'm all over.
So she speaks about it. In 1964, remember, that's the year after the assassination. So Mike Douglas is trying to gear all of the conversation to Jackie. And she very deftly gears it away and says, as I say in the book, that Janet Auchincloss was the most beautiful woman she had ever seen. And she was still saying that in the wake of everything that had happened, which I was like, wow, that was some real dedication to Janet in terms of that. The only other thing in terms of by her own design is when Janet meets her match, of course, is all the furor around the wedding and around the dress, in terms of Jackie, what she wanted but couldn't have, and the fact that really kind of both of them, both Janet Auchincloss and Joseph P. Kennedy, kind of ganged up on her in terms of the dress.
I wanted to ask you about that, because Jackie didn't like that dress.
She did not like the
Which
dress.
is amazing to me.
It's like that,
it was too old-fashioned and...
Too old-fashioned. She thought it looked like a lampshade. It's like Carolyn Kennedy.
She thought it made her look flat-chested.
Flat-chested as
So
well.
I made her
Yeah.
flat-chested, that was the whole aspect of that. That these are remarks that she made that were on record in terms of the fact that she didn't like her. But part of that was her not being the capital J Jackie global icon at that point, but still being this impressionable young woman who couldn't stand up for what she wanted in that moment, because people know about the wedding. There were 800 guests at the church, the entire United States Senate and their wives, and 1,200 at the reception at Hammersmith Farm.
And all the crowds of just onlookers.
Yeah, and then all the crowds waiting.
Yeah,
when you see
outside
the
the
footage
church. Yeah.
of it, and you look at the footage, and you look at the footage of Jackie. She's not happy
No,
at
she's
all.
not.
She's like some very sad kind of look on her face.
Has everybody, it's been so photographed. Does everybody know what the dress looks like that we're talking about? I had to go look at pictures of it because I just wanted to
That's
see
it.
it.
He has it on his phone. Yeah.
I should have brought a slide for Randall to show us. It's an amazing dress.
Oh, was it on the slide?
No, I've meant to. And
Oh, you meant to. Okay.
How
Yeah.
long was the train? How long?
It wasn't
like a bell.
Yeah, it was more like a bell style.
The train was like the veil, which
Yes.
was,
Oh, the
that
veil was insane.
not,
Well, the veil was actually a Lee family heirloom.
Yeah.
That Anne had nothing to do with the veil.
Yeah, I learned that from your book.
Yeah. So it was a family heirloom. And Lee, her sister, who had just gotten married a couple months before, had also worn the veil in terms of that. But the thing was about the dress, it was made out of 50 yards of ivory taffeta.
Portrait neckline.
Yes.
Tiny
and
waist,
so
huge
it was a
skirt.
big, heavy dress, and part of what had inspired her was the Montgomery bells that she had previously, she and her mother and her grandmother had designed for out of Alabama. Her mother and her grandmother had been seamstresses in Alabama who sewed for all of the women, the wives of, not the women of the legislature, because that wasn't happening, but the women who were the wives of the legislatures in Alabama. And the First Lady of Alabama was actually her first commission when her mother died. It was not unexpected death when she was 16, and she went to go tell this First Lady that her mother had died, and she was like, I'm so sorry to hear that, and what about my dresses? She finished it, 4 dresses.
After I read the book, I wanted to go see the dress, and I'm a museum person, so I wanted to know if it was on display anywhere, and they can't display it. It was made for the wedding. Like, it's so heavy that it's not meant to hang up forever. The weight of it, it will destroy it.
And she wore that through the reception, right? She
Yes.
Wore it through the reception.
Yeah.
There are a lot of pictures online of her having to gather it up.
She
and
gathered
deal
it,
with
yeah, she gathered it up, man.
It was quite, 50 yards of fabric.
Yeah.
But to take it back to the mother, she's a larger character in this book, and it's wrong. I know it's wrong. She may be my favorite.
She may be mine too. I have to give her props. So she was a tough gal. She married a wildly unsuitable first husband in Black Jack Bouvier. This was Jackie and Lee's father. He was an alcoholic. He was a philanderer. It was a miserable marriage. He was cheating. He cheated on their honeymoon on the ocean liner that was taking them across the Atlantic with Doris Duke. And it was just wildly unhappy and volatile, and she extricated herself. And at that time, divorce was still a big deal. So I think the expectation was you just go off to some corner, wear your dowdy clothes and don't come out again. She went after a Standard Oil heir in Hugh Auchincloss, who was also functionally impotent, but she managed to get 2 children out of him as well. So she knew what she wanted. She had her eyes on the prize at all times. And she was a formidable figure, and she and Jackie had the classic love-hate relationship. I should also add, in relation to the wedding, that Jackie did not approve of this wedding. Janet did not approve of this wedding. She would completely disdain the Kennedys. They were new money, they were brash and vulgar, and the Auchinclosses, of course, were Newport and old money and breeding, and so she really resisted it almost until the last minute. She was not a happy mother-in-law going into this, and the marriage, of course, was troubled as well. So she's found ways to be there for her daughter in the end. Anyway, but I love Janet too. She's a horror. I would have been terrified of her, but she's a fun character.
She's a terrifying human
Maybe
being.
Anne was kissing up to her. I don't know.
I enjoyed meeting her on the pages of a book.
Exactly. Who has it said something like Dickens' characters are people you'd never want to meet in real life, but on the page they're lovely. You just can't get enough of them. Yeah.
So here's what's going to happen. In just a minute, I'm going to ask each of them to read just a little bit from the book, just from, not from each book, to give you a bit of flavor and a bit of understanding about the voice. I love these books. I'm going to remind you again, you need to buy them from Eagle Eye. And you know what? You should get 2. They're small. And it's also like a great book club book, and it's a great gift book. A signed book is the gift that you want to give. And you can do that tonight. You too, at home, important to buy it from your local independent. The other thing I want to tell you is, after they read, we're going to let you guys ask them some questions instead of me yammering all night. But something is going to happen. Like, the minute they finish reading, and I'm going to turn to you and I'm going to say, hey, you guys, now what would you like to ask? There will be a rip in the space-time continuum, and it'll be right on the stairs. On your side, time will continue normally, and up here where we are, it's going to slow down to just agony. I will literally complete menopause and die in about 4 seconds if you don't help me with this. So I know you have questions. Be ready. When I turn to you and say, okay, thank you for reading, what do you guys want to know? Get up to that microphone or just yell.
So they have to come down. That's the point, right? You have to come down to the...
You don't have to come down, but as you can tell, it's better. If I can hear you, I will repeat it. If you're shy, Mr. Wynn right here will bring the microphone to you. Just kind of raise your hand if you're wanting to ask a question. Mr. Wynn, our sound executive / my hot husband, will handle that for you. All right. Who wants to start? Who feels ready? You got your pages marked?
Do you mind?
Not at all.
To say this is your book, so I don't want to...
No, please. It's also your book.
New York City, New York, September 6, 1953. By the end of my life, I was stone blind because I used up all of my eyesight creating beautiful gowns for the richest women in the social register. However, on this one day, the Sunday before Labor Day in the year of our Lord, 1953, God laid his healing hands on my failing eyes so I could see a sharp cut on a water pipe in the ceiling of my dress shop. Cut wide open, maybe with a hatchet, that pipe spilled gallons of foul-smelling water onto the floor of the shop I had worked 20 years to open. The eggshell carpet, as well as the olive green gilt chairs my client sat on, got stained a sickening shit brown. When the landlord poked at them, the chairs squished and bubbled suds at the edges of the seats. I might have been able to take that in, but that wasn't the worst, no. The most horrible part was that the pipe had opened up over the top of the most important dress commission of my life, the most important dress of the 20th century. The dress belonged to one Jacqueline Bouvier, who was due to marry John F. Kennedy in just 6 days' time. The rosettes on the ball gown skirt, my usual flower touch, seized up streaks of brown, and the off-the-shoulder bodice said completely off the shoulders of the headless mannequin. The rest of the dresses, saturated with yellow instead of ivory white, made sad-sounding drips of wastewater that plopped to my white carpet in a discordant symphony. Is it possible for anyone, even for a piddly bird-like little black woman like me from small-town Clayton, Alabama, to ever have a lower moment? The Almighty himself put the thought in my mind. The water pipe that dumped all of that stink into my shop didn't burst all by itself. Only now I cast my poor eyesight down to my trusty step stool, turned topsy-turvy behind the mannequin in someone's haste to leave my life in a mess. Sally, my older sister, said the words that trailed across my mind like a dress seam. Who hate you enough to do this, Annie? Sally loved me so well she couldn't see it. But even if I had my poor eyesight days, I saw it. I knew of a handful of people who had enough red-hot demon hate in their blood that they would relish to see me fall.
It's a great ending line. They would relish to see me fall.
So this is from the first chapter. I think it's good to go early in the book, right? No spoilers. This is the first meeting between Jackie and Lem, the first time they meet. It's the weekend before St. Patrick's Day, 1952, and there's still a late winter nip in the air, but Jack always keeps the top of the Ford Crestline down because by age 34, he knows how dashing his hair looks in high wind. Oh. We're due at Bobby and Ethel's that night, but Jack instead cuts across Chain Bridge. I shoot him a look and he says, imagine the offhandedness that we have an additional passenger. Oh yes, I say, and who should that be? A Miss Bouvier. Mind you, there's nothing in that honorific miss to signify a lady of distinction. He refers to virtually all his girls that way. She might be a cashier at the Montel Pharmacy or Finland's deputy chief of mission. And you won't know until you've pulled up in front of her apartment building and seen her tottering through the front gate. A blonde in a crew neck cardigan or a brunette in a bullet bra. And it's always the latter who raises her hand for you to kiss, and the former who comes at you straight on like an encyclopedia salesman. And whoever it is remains Miss in our conversation until such time as the business is consummated, at which point she devolves into her component parts. There is nothing, in short, about a Miss Bouvier to separate her from her predecessors. She is a destination. And now that we've crossed into Virginia, the only thing left to figure out is where she might live. Where they're going is to Marywood, where Jackie lives on the baronial Auchincloss estate just off the Potomac River. Lem doesn't know this, of course. So all I can make out through my encrusted specs are a row of white pilasters and a front portico where sits a girl. Doesn't she hear the car's tires on the gravel or see our headlights slicing through the trees? When we first happen upon her, her face is angled away as though she's cocking her ear for a nightingale. Her knees are drawn protectively to her chest, and there's something quite exposed about her. I mean, she doesn't look like she belongs there any more than I do. And I briefly wonder if she's a housemaid or a nanny taking her one allotted evening out. Abruptly, she stands and gives us 2 quick waves, and then as she jogs to the passenger side, comes briefly ablaze in the headlights. By now, of course, I'm extricating myself from the front of the car and inserting myself with no great grace into the back, and the operation is so consuming that for a second or two I lose all consciousness of her. And then I hear her say, in that voice, like a ghost whispering through the pipes, "You must be Lem." Thank you. Thank you.
I knew I was going to love that book when I hit the line about how he noticed how dashing he looked in a convertible, and it does so many things. It takes us right to the end of his life. It also takes us to his beauty and his iconic good looks, and it was just wonderful.
He actually helped kill off men's hats because he never wore them. So
Speaking of fashion.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Do you have any questions for these authors? Come grab it.
He's going to go to the mic. A brave soul.
Maybe I missed something, but how did she make the transition from whatever she started as, to somebody who was doing good fashion stuff for the highfalutin.
Sheer determination, but also.
Can you tell a little bit about the transition?
Well, when you say transition, she was brought up with those two women, and that is one thing that a lot of people have been talking about in terms of the book, is sort of these subsequent communities of women that Anne is fostered and nurtured by. Her mother and her grandmother, who sewed. That's what they did. Her grandmother, Georgia Tompkins, had been enslaved in a different part of Alabama, and her grandfather came along and bought her freedom on the condition that they stay where she had been enslaved, because the mistress still wanted access to those excellent sewing skills that her grandmother had. So her grandmother did it, her mother did it, and she was a bit of a prodigy. When she was 6, she started to pick up the scraps of whatever they were sewing and make fabric flowers. So the floral touch that I referenced in my reading was always a way in which Anne felt that a woman's body should look feminine. So there was always a floral aspect in terms of her designs. She started that at 6, and then again, come to find out from the interview, she made her first dress when she was 8, made her first patterns when she was 10. This is somebody who was a prodigy, an artistic prodigy. So her dresses that remain to us, and anybody out there who's looking, don't go look in your attics. There may be something there. Things are still being discovered, but they're in museums for a reason. The craft of what she was able to put together was extraordinary. The other commission that, if you don't mind, I can throw in and talk about, she did Olivia de Havilland's dress when she won her first Oscar. So you look up Olivia de Havilland's, her first Oscar dress, which was an early example of a strapless dress that later became, just within a few years, very popular. I wonder if she didn't have something to do with that. And instead of the fabric, the florals on it, she hand-painted all of that flower that goes from this side of the gown down the gown to the bottom without a stencil, as she said. That's what I said on the Mike Douglas show. She's just, talking about this, about that. Yes, I hand-painted that, just Southern lady, just very quiet, without a stencil. I was like, say what? Just an amazing artistic mind that was directed in that way. So it's always one of these things that I've always wondered in terms of people's talents who were not permitted to let them be directed in the conventional ways because of racism or enslavement or whatever. What somebody could do. She's an example of that.
But she also, it sounded like she had good fortune in her patronesses, right? Because people could see, I think, just how excellent her craft was. This is how she ends up in Tampa when she's with the husband, the pedophile.
Lee.
Lee. Yeah, the Lee, the name that haunted her throughout her life in various ways, I might add.
Weird. You can't make that up.
I know. That was like, usually I'm so big on names in the book, in terms of changing them or whatever. Lee was the name that haunted this woman throughout her life. But her husband took them to Dothan, and when she was in Dothan, the citrus magnates who liked to vacation there, one of the wives saw her dressed and asked who made her dress. And as the story goes, the woman asked if she could come and sew for her daughters. She had 4 daughters and was at her wit's end. The 2 of them, the twins that were getting married at the same time, the trousseaus, all of that stuff. And she left her husband and went to Tampa, where she spent a number of years. In Florida, people who know about Tampa know they have the Gasparilla celebrations every year. She was the on-record designer for the Gasparilla from 1924 to 1926. So this was a woman of great artistic talent, just expressed in that way.
So I had another strange convergence when I was thinking about these two books, and you touched on it a little bit here, but I want to start here with this. One thing that it struck me in the same way that, I might be wrong. I might be wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong. In the same way that he never says that he is gay, he never really overtly addresses his loneliness, but it's a character.
Yeah.
And I would call this book sparkling. I would call this book charming. I would call this book witty and intriguing, but there is a thread through it where sometimes it would just take my breath away. Can you talk about that a little bit and how you did that, and is that essential to his nature, or?
I think I just projected myself into the head of what it was like. It's interesting. I will say that this is a little bit of a spoiler, but not really. At one point, Lem gets arrested for soliciting a man in Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C., which didn't, I should say, that this is the alternative history part. There's no record that this happened to him, but it was so common to gay men of his generation. They were constantly harassed and arrested, and Bayard Rustin and, a bunch of folks. And I started reading this at it was a crime story reading, just this episode of him being arrested and dragged off to jail. And as I was reading it, I started crying. I sort of weirdly projected myself into Lem's world. And I realized that I was warned some years later, but I think for gay men of a certain age, you're still waiting for someone to come for you, right? There's still this fear that someone is going to take this away from you, especially given our Supreme Court right now. So that's the only political remark I will make. But it wasn't too hard to kind of get there because I grew up in the 70s and it wasn't much more acceptable then. So I kind of knew where he was coming from, and I'd met gay men of his generation, and I knew what they were like and how they were afraid. Still, they were, even when they were out, they weren't out. So loneliness was an inevitable component of that.
I feel that I'm trying not to give away too much of the history in terms of her relationships, but we can definitely talk about her first marriage because we have been doing that. But to me, that was an incredibly lonely marriage. And there is because he isolated her in a lot of ways. I don't just mean, obviously they weren't great friends. He was an alcoholic, abusive pedophile, but not a great catch. But he also isolated her in several ways. And there's a scene, I think the scene where I really understood it was, I love her grandmother.
Oh, I do too.
Yeah.
Wonderful character. When she shows up, can you talk about her loneliness a little bit?
Yeah, the actual, in terms of the record, the historical record that exists, and there's actually more that exists because some of the family has come forward since, and there are tapes, somebody's going to get a hold of and hear all of those tapes in terms of what her granddaughter relayed in terms of her life. But the way it went is that he wanted her to stop sewing completely. In that 1910 census record, though, where Anne's dyslexic age shows up, it records that Lee was a tailor. So to me, I was like, he wanted her to stop, really, I was like, I could do something with that fictionally, in which, he's using her skill set for himself in order to advance himself. And so there was that constant underpinning of Lee always saying, yeah, did you tell him about me and how I can make these great men's suits and all this other kind of stuff, and uses it as a way literally to hook her in terms of thinking that they had something in common in terms of that. But part of her a desire to hurry up and grow up so that she could be more like her mother and her grandmother did lead to this very lonely existence that in my descriptions I tried to paint with the whole notion of drab men suiting the wools and the dark colors and everything that was not anything that she wanted to do in terms of the vibrant colors and the ways in which that her grandmother and mother were doing so. Those, you know, those early years of her marriage, that's how I depicted that.
It's funny, speaking of loneliness, I mean, you talk about her as a great artist, which obviously she was, and she's the only one who could do what she did. So at some level, she has to work alone. Even when there are other people in the room, she's the only one who can bring this vision to life. So there's something just lonely about being an artist at that point.
That's true, too. Yeah.
But in a weird way, you could say that about Lim, too. He was not crafting a dress, he was crafting a courtship.
Yeah.
Like, there was some artisanship going on there in terms of...
Well, that's true. Yeah, he's drafted to kind of make this courtship happen, to keep Jackie, you know, interested, still willing, even as Jack is going off on political engagements or erotic engagements. So yeah, he definitely has to he's a matchmaker of sorts. But the loneliness thing really resonates for me. Jackie too, at this time in her life, she doesn't have a lot of really, you know, close friends that she can confide in, and she is kind of stuck out in this big estate with not a lot of people that she knows. So they were two lonely people who happened to find each other, and they both happen to love the same guy more than perhaps they should have.
Yeah, more than perhaps they should have is a very good way to, I mean, in personal terms, certainly, I think that's true. Well, oh gosh, I was going somewhere and I really wanted to ask you. My brain just died. You just said something that made me want to follow up. It'll come back. Maybe it'll come back. All right, we are down to like 5 minutes. So if anybody has a question, this is your chance, or forever hold your peace.
In a church.
Well, what's next for you guys?
That's a good question. That's okay. I am working on American Daughters, which is about the secret interracial friendship between Portia Washington and Alice Roosevelt. So everybody knows about reckless Alice Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Right.
Who's Portia?
Portia is Booker T. Washington's daughter. So, if you will, the daughter of the President of the United States and the daughter of the sort of black president of the United States at that time, managed to become friends just after the explosion of when new President Theodore Roosevelt, who had been new president because of the assassination of McKinley, had the nerve to invite Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House, and the ensuing explosion that happened after that, because Booker T. Washington had been the first black man to be invited to the White House for dinner. Their two rebellious eldest daughters, who had a lot in common, managed to craft a friendship over the first part of the 20th century. So that's what American Daughters is about, and hopefully next fall you'll be able to read that.
She's fast. So are you. So are you. I'm one of those authors who doesn't speak of something until it goes out into the world. Are you that way? No. No, you're not at all. So I'm working on something. It hasn't.
You're researching.
I'm researching and I'm writing too, and at the same time. And I will say there's not a president involved. I've done 3 presidents, and I think I'm done.
Presidented out.
Presidented out. I'm president out.
Well, since you're not going to tell us, I got back to it, and I want
Okay. Go.
So what I want to know is, like, when you were really trying to bring this history to life and get as much research as you could and imagine and fill in, but you were just straight up writing an alternative history. But there's, like, some of these people, their children are still alive. Like, how careful do you have to be, and how do you handle that?
Yeah. That's a really good question. That is the first time I've faced that, where some of the characters are still alive.
Yeah, with Lincoln.
Yeah, no, nobody's going to come after me. No, Bobby Jr. is a character in it. And there are also, of course, people still alive who knew Jack and Jackie and Lem, and I hear from them now and again. Actually, one of the pleasures of going out to doing these events is inevitably someone will come forward, sometimes totter forward, and tell me about some encounter they had with a Kennedy. There are women of a certain generation who, I think they all kept Jackie's scrapbooks. They just kept Jackie's, they still have them, in some attic somewhere, along with the dresses that Ann Lowe designed, perhaps. So they're still alive. The Kennedys are still alive in a lot of ways. I haven't gotten any pushback yet. My feeling is that the Kennedys, I think there's so much been written about them. I can't imagine that one more book is going to even like register.
Also,
for them.
it's a beautiful book. Everybody, thank you so much for coming. Thank you guys so much
Thank
for
you,
coming.
Joshilyn.
Don't forget to get your copies of these wonderful books, and we will see you next week with Sonali Dev with her continuing series of Jane Austen rewrites when Nikki Salcedo will be your host. And thank you guys for joining us online.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you want to get a book signed, they will be hanging around.
Yes, Eagle Eye has pre-signed copies back there, but if you guys need a dedication or something like that, please do come up and they will go ahead and inscribe those there for you. Once again, thank you all so very, very much, and we will see you again next week and in the future. Have a wonderful evening.